Hello viewers, Super GT here. Last week I was lucky enough to receive a code to Gran Turismo 7. I've been putting in a very good amount of hours, and here I bring you my review of the game. I will also be bringing out lots of gameplay in the coming days, so please do get subscribed for all of that. And if you have any further questions about the game, do ask in the comment section below. Now I'm going to divide this review up into the following sections, and as you can probably tell, there is quite a lot to get through. So let's begin. Now the game's main GT mode revolves around a nice world map from which you choose the mode, so it has a kind of nostalgic feel similar to the older games. And at least to begin with, in this GT mode you're going to be jumping between the cafe menus and the world circuits. So essentially you accept a menu book from the cafe, you're then told to collect 3 cars, and you can do that either by competing in events or simply by buying the car. So in order to compete in these races you have to meet certain regulations. Often it is the PP rating, the car itself, the tyre choice, or the region from which the car is from. And the events have a certain nostalgia to them, and it really does feel like a numbered Gran Turismo game once again. I actually really enjoyed playing through the GT mode with a range of different cars. I would say that the chase style races weren't typically as fun as the grid starts, so some of the races you'd start a good 30 seconds or so behind the leader, and then you'd have to try to catch up. And then some of the races were grid starts, so you're a lot more balanced, and these were a lot more fun, I thought. For example, I had this really good race at Tsukuba where it was a grid start. I then had to work pretty hard to catch up with this Porsche, and then going for a massive dive bomb on the final lap. And this Clubman race here, it was a high speed ring, also very fun. It was a really balanced race against the AI, and I had to wait until the final lap to get the overtake done. So once you complete the races in question and earn the 3 cars it told you to get, you then go back to the cafe, and then you get a new menu book, and then you progress through the game like this. Now what I would say is that I felt as though car collection was perhaps forced upon you a little bit too much. You can of course skip through the cutscenes and through all the information if you're not particularly interested, and you do eventually get to a point where you complete all of the menu books, and then the game opens up a little bit more. For some of the races I feel as though I didn't have enough information about the races. For example, it would rain and I didn't have any inters or wets, so I'd back out, go and buy some inters, join back into the race, and then the conditions would have been different. So sometimes it wasn't completely clear which equipment I had to bring to the party. But having said all of this, I would say that I actually really enjoyed the career mode. It was a very good mode. I haven't unlocked everything in it yet, but from what I have played, I did enjoy it. Now progression wasn't particularly quick. Given that it takes a couple of hours to unlock licenses and the multiplayer, you do get the feeling from the beginning that you're in this game for the long haul. Now I personally didn't mind playing through some of the races to unlock these modes, but I do imagine that many people may be a little bit frustrated with having to play a couple of hours to unlock multiplayer, for example. Money is fairly hard to come by. Now you can obviously grind the money and earn it, but I think you do have to be fairly well considered with your purchases. So if you're going to drop $1 million on a car, you have to make sure that that's the car you definitely want, because it will take a while to gain back $1 million in credits. I did actually rather enjoy the challenge of trying to get a foothold in the game, trying to acquire cars, trying to acquire money. And you can certainly say about Gran Turismo 7, it's one of those games that is not just going to hand you everything on a plate. The events in the world circuits aren't completely open choice, and therefore I haven't unlocked all of the events. I don't know how many events there are. Quite tricky for me to give a true indication of scale of this mode, but overall I think it's definitely going to be a long game mode, and there's going to be a lot of grinding to be done. As you collect more cars in the game, you rank up a collector level and you get awarded prizes and roulette tickets, which you can cash in for money. And the roulette wasn't particularly kind to me, giving me the smallest prize on multiple occasions, like 2,000 credits. Even the bigger prizes, sort of 10,000 credits, weren't particularly much. And that kind of just, again, hammers home the point that you will have to work for your money and your cars. What I would say is that there seems to perhaps be too much of a focus on car collection and not as much on driving or racing, as there is no driver level in the game. The main level that you're ranking up is a car collection level. Now, I think it will be a good challenge trying to buy all of the cars in the game, and I don't mind having a car collector level, but I think having a driver level alongside that would have been a nice addition. Okay, physics. This is a very important aspect of Gran Turismo 7. Now, I could instantly tell that Gran Turismo 7 had far more detailed physics than in previous games. So I think gone are the days of trying to just brute force a car into a corner by steering to the maximum amount and then smashing the throttle on the exit. There is much more need now to be precise with your inputs, your steering, your throttle and your brake. I found that to be more strict with braking in a straight line, and also on the corner exit I had to accelerate in a straighter line if possible. Overall, the physics are undoubtedly much more lively and detailed than what I've encountered before in previous Gran Turismo games. I would say that this is more of a sim than GT Sport, for example. In the early stage of the game, I tried the Maggior circuit experience, and they give you the Alpha Group 3 car to drive for that. And I actually found it a really good challenge trying to be more precise with this. Just Sector 1, it's just a couple of corners, but to begin with I was pushing way too hard on the steering, and the car was oversteering, understeering, and that's because I just was not being precise enough. Curbs have a much more realistic feel to them. You hit them at the wrong angle and you can certainly get punished, as you can see here with the example at Suzuka Degna 1. The curbs actually matter now. You can't just easily go over them as if they're flat. You do have to take them into consideration. You also have to take bumps into consideration now. As you can see here, I had a massive accident at the Nürburgring. I was steering a little bit too hard at high speed over this big bump, and it threw me quite violently into the barrier. The same also applies to crests. You have to be fairly considered with your steering and throttle input when going over a crest, as the car will go light and you'll get less traction, you'll get more wheel spin, so you have to be very careful with curbs, with crests, with bumps. So to summarise that, the cars are much more lively in terms of how they handle, but also how they interact with the circuit. There's a lot more detail with the car, there's a lot more detail with the car and its response to the track. And this is really good. I think this is a really good challenge. I really enjoyed trying to develop my driving style and just be a bit more precise. Different cars have different personalities to them and need to be driven differently, I noted. I tuned up this Subaru BRZ for a race, and I wanted it to be a handling car, and it was actually very easy to drive around the corners. And then I had this Ford GT, which I tuned up, a lot of power, but it wasn't very good in the corners, and therefore I had to drive it differently to the Subaru. Group 3 cars are also wildly different. I have 3 Group 3 cars in the game. The BMW M6 was an absolute handful on the throttle. The Audi was a nightmare for lift-off oversteer. But then the Porsche 911 was very easy to drive. So the 3 cars had very different personalities, and it was actually really good trying to adjust to each one. So overall, I say the physics are very detailed, and it takes a very big conscious effort to be fast. You have to be very careful, a lot more precise, and it's not as easy to be truly fast on this game. The rain physics are really good. I really enjoyed driving in the rain. We will get to this a little bit in more detail later on, but the rain felt very good to drive in. The puddles can easily make you spin out, so you have to be conscious of them and learn their location on each track. And judging the changing conditions was a good challenge. I'd say that slipstream is modelled more realistically in Gran Turismo 7. We experimented with this on the Nürburgring straight, and we wasn't actually really gaining a huge amount of time, and I felt like it was a bit more realistic compared to Gran Turismo Sport. One big issue I found with the physics was that of the jumps in Rally. I think it was far too hard to control your car upon landing. The game seriously wanted to send me to the Shadow Realm every time my car left the ground and returned back to it, to the extent that I had to go really slow over the jumps, and against some decent AI it was actually quite hard to stay ahead. Weather and dynamic time, really big feature that has been added into Gran Turismo 7. I think it's important to note firstly that the weather or the rain option is not available at all of the circuits. It's available at Spa, Nürburgring, Red Bull Ring, Le Mans, Autopolis, Suzuka, Fuji, Tokyo Expressway, Tsukuba, and High Speed Ring. So none of the American tracks have the rain option available. So it is a solid choice of tracks that have the rain, but it isn't all of them. So in the options menu for the custom races, you can change the percentage chance of rain throughout different points of the race. And the longer the race is, the more times you can change the weather conditions at different points in the race. You could also leave it random if you want. And the rain certainly has a very convincing feel to it. You know, the darkness of the sky, the way that it just begins to come down when it's originally dry and it starts raining. It does feel convincing to me. So how do the wet races play out? Well, typically you're going to be watching three things. Obviously the track itself, but then also the grip meter at the bottom left, and also the rain radar. So there is quite a lot to take in, but I wouldn't say it's overly complicated. So typically you're looking at the grip meter. If it's in the bottom third, you can survive on slick tyres or dry tyres. If it's in the middle third, then you're probably going to need inters. And if it's in the top third, you're better off on wets. Couple that with looking at the rain radar, and you're going to have to make your own judgment on the tyres that you need and the speed that you need to start going into corners. And these rain races are a really good challenge. I found them really good fun. They're very enjoyable, trying to adjust the way that you drive throughout a race. I think this is a really solid addition to Gran Turismo 7. I really enjoyed it, and I think it's going to add a lot of longevity to the game. Dynamic time as well, this is something that's been done really well. They went on about this a lot in the build-up to the release of the game, and quite rightly so. It's available on all of the circuits, and then you can set a race to fast forward the time by 10 times. The game looks really spectacular at sunset, as you can see here on the main straight at Fuji, with the sun beating down on you just before it sets. And also at sunrise, look at this example at Tokyo, the light reflecting off of the buildings in the city. Overall, to me, the feeling of the environment, with the lighting, with the different times of day, it's just very convincing. The settings for the weather and the time aren't completely open choice, but with all the options available, the fact that you can fast forward the time, there are a lot of options here, and I think this should satisfy most people. Okay, graphics. Now, Gran Turismo tends to always get the graphics right, and this is certainly no exception. The cars, as ever, are modelled to a very high level of detail, more so than in any other previous game. And the tracks also have a very convincing feel to them. I think just the scale of the circuits, it really does feel very convincing and realistic. For example, Brands Hatch, it's a track I've driven in real life multiple times, and just the scale of it, the elevation change, it does feel very real. Now, I tried the frame rate mode and the ray tracing mode. They suggest that you use the frame rate mode for racing, and then the ray tracing mode for replays and photos and the menus. And to be honest, it would have been nice just to have one setting where it just diverts to the frame rate mode when you are racing, and then changes over to the ray tracing mode when you're not racing. I think that would have just been the easiest option for everyone. To test out the ray tracing mode when racing, I loaded up the Nürburgring with heavy rain, and I did notice some slight drops in the FPS. It wasn't game breaking or too bad, but it is definitely ideal to use the frame rate mode whenever you are racing. The replays look absolutely incredible. I think this is actually probably the best looking part of the game. It looks better in the replays than it does actually when you are racing, I would say. And for me, it's got to be the best racing games in terms of visuals. I can't really think of a better one. Although, having said that, I think that the track surfaces are sometimes a little bit dull and could have been a bit more detailed. In terms of the sounds of the menus in the GT mode have a certain nostalgic old school quality to them. There's seemingly a million different songs in the game, although admittedly I turned off the in-race music. In terms of the sounds of the cars, some of the cars sound really intense and incredible. Others sound a little bit more flat. It was good to hear the audible differences to the cars as well after you tuning them. So sometimes you add a supercharger or a turbo, and you can evidently hear that difference. So I think the sound in Gran Turismo 7 it is solid. It's good. It's probably not as good as, let's say, Assetto Corsa Competizione, but that's not to say that GT7 does it badly. Now, the multiplayer, I think this is going to be a very important aspect of the game, something that a lot of people are very keen to see. Now, I haven't been able to have the full multiplayer experience yet, of course, but I did manage to do some online races. If we look at sport mode, there are 3 daily races alongside the championships. I would have been happier to see a slightly more developed multiplayer compared to GT Sport, but I'm willing to certainly see how this one pans out. Tuning is now a key component of sport mode, so a lot of the races are limited by your PP rating. So I joined a couple of races. This first one here at High Speed Ring, I was easily beaten, as perhaps I didn't put enough time into developing a good tune or setup for my car. The second race I had was at Trial Mountain, and it was actually an incredibly fun race, very well balanced. And then the third race I had was at Deep Forest. There was only 3 of us in the race, but it was incredibly close and very entertaining indeed. So once I saw that a lot of the races had tuning involved, I was actually quite worried. But I think time will tell how tuning truly turns out. We don't know if there's going to be any overpowered elements or anything like that. We don't know how well balanced it's going to be. And I think in some ways this is going to make the game slightly less accessible, as I think you're going to have to put a lot more time into working on your car, making your car more competitive with the tune. Championships are present in the game, and they're going to feature this new leagues concept, which will divide the players up into more balanced races. Now, I don't know exactly how that is going to work out, whether or not that's a big feature or a small feature. I'm not really sure exactly. And overall, I think it's quite tricky to give a final verdict for the multiplayer because we haven't really played it properly yet. I would say the race I had were entertaining, but I think this one we'll have to wait and see exactly how this turns out. There are some new penalties introduced into the game, so we have penalties for overtaking under yellow flags. There's also penalties for crossing the pit exit line, although penalties for collisions didn't seem to be particularly evident. There was one collision I had in this Deep Forest race, and I don't think there's a penalty dished out for it. So it's hard to say exactly, again, at this stage, whether or not the penalty system is going to be good or bad, or how exactly it's going to work. So the AI, I think this is an important aspect because I think a lot of us are going to be playing the single player a fair amount, and therefore we want to have some decent races against the AI. Firstly, there's multiple difficulty settings available, which is good. The AI seem to have at least some personality and can be very good fun to race against. They're not just purely robotic cars which can be abused. They seem a little bit weird on the chase the rabbit style races where you start far behind the leader. They sometimes just move about a bit weirdly, their movement is a bit strange. But when the AI is more evenly balanced with your PP rating, I think the races can actually be pretty good. I would say that the hardest AI is actually fairly easy to beat. I wouldn't say that you have too much trouble. You're probably just going to have to turn up to the races with a slightly underpowered car, and then you'll have a good race. One final note on the AI is that I think that they are slightly better in the rain than they are in the dry. So if you start off on a dry race, you might easily fly by some of the AI. Then if it starts raining, they're going to have a slightly easier time. So the licenses then, an integral part of any numbered Gran Turismo game. There's 5 different licenses with 10 tests within each, so 50 in total. And you know what? They were very fun to complete. I actually really enjoyed the licenses in Gran Turismo 7. For the most part, I could complete them on gold first time, so I don't think they were particularly difficult. There are only 2 tests that I found really that hard. That includes the last one, and this one did actually take a very long time. So if you're going to try and get all gold on all of the licenses, then actually it is quite a bit of a challenge. It's just that for most of the licenses, it's actually quite easy to get gold, I would say. So within the GT mode, if you go into the World Circuits menu, you have Circuit Experience, Time Trials, Drift Trials, Arcade Race, Custom Race, and then the meeting places as well. So there's a good range of modes, and then aside from that, of course, you have the licenses, which we've just spoken about, the multiplayer as well. The missions are good fun, something a little bit different, and I think the range of modes here is very good. I think there's a good amount of content overall here. The other mode is Music Rally, which is quite a short-lived mode. It was quite a weird, gimmicky mode, I must say. There's only 6 of them, and it was fairly fun. It was something different. But overall, in terms of the modes, I think there's a good range here. I think there's something for everyone. And I think most importantly, there's some really good longevity here. Okay, let's talk about the tracks. So 34 locations in the game, we knew about that. So we have a decent amount of tracks. I would have certainly liked to have seen a few more, but I would definitely say that Gran Turismo 7 is a case of quality over quantity. And even having said that, the quantity isn't that bad. Let's not forget that the tracks now are much more detailed with dynamic time, weather on some of them, and then you have the details with the bumps and the curbs. So what is there is done very well. There are a couple of new layouts though, so we have this very interesting layout at Alsace, this test course, which is very undulating, as you can see. There's also a new layout at Maggiore, which we haven't seen before. Both of these tracks have new pit lanes, and I would say that the tracks have been overhauled from GT Sport. It seems as though every track has been remodeled from the ground up. So we've spoken about the tracks, let's talk about the cars. Over 420 in the game at launch, which is a solid total. Obviously it doesn't quite match up to the 1000 or more we saw in GT6. But just like the tracks, the cars have been modelled in a very high level of detail, and I think this is the reason for there not being quite as many. In terms of the Group 3 and Group 4 cars, only a handful of new ones. I think it would have been very nice to see an updated list of the race cars, for example Ferrari 488, the Aston Martin Vantage. I think it would have been nice to see a couple more new ones, so it was a little bit disappointing to only have a handful of new ones there. But if GT Sport is anything to go by, hopefully we can expect to see a decent amount of circuits and cars added to the game post-launch. Now during my playtime on Gran Turismo 7, I did it all on the PlayStation 5, and therefore I was not able to test it on a PS4. I think a lot of people want to know how good it is on a PS4, because most people can't get a PS5. It's very difficult to do that at the moment. So unfortunately I wasn't able to test it. This is something that I will do because I was not able to download the game on PS4 as well as my PS5. But once the game is properly released, then I will be able to do that. Something I was able to test though is that of the controller. Now I think a lot of players will be on the controller as opposed to the wheel, and therefore I thought it was a good idea to test it out. Now it's fair to say that I'm very much out of practice with the controller, but I think I still did fairly well, was able to hold my own and adjust to it quite quickly, and that's even with the assists off. So the feedback is actually really good on the controller. They have this new haptic feedback system, and I actually really like the way it felt. The only thing I wasn't so keen on was the brake trigger, so L2 where I was braking felt a little bit stiff and quite hard to adjust to that, but the rest of it was actually really good. So for example, if you touched a curb on the left hand side of the car, the left part of the controller would vibrate, and I really like that detail. When you shifted gears, the controller would slightly vibrate as well, and I felt like it wasn't intrusive, it wasn't over the top, it wasn't too much. There is of course the option to turn it off or turn it down for those who don't really want to bother with it, but I would say it was actually really good. Now it's hard to say how the controller will compare to the wheel in terms of pure speed. I'd still imagine the wheel to have the edge, but I think this is going to have to be properly tested. I think that there's a very good balance in Gran Turismo 7 in terms of the difficulty. So even though I have described the game as being much more delicate to play in terms of the physics and how the cars handle, I still think that this is a game for everyone. For those who are just starting out, maybe you've never played a racing game before, there's lots of tutorials to help you and assists to help you out as well. And therefore I would not be put off from buying this game if you are new to Gran Turismo or if you're new to racing games entirely. And for more experienced players, the higher level of detail in the physics will give you a solid challenge, and I think lots of you will enjoy trying to adjust yourself to become faster on this game. Now tuning is a very fun aspect of this game. I actually really enjoyed this. In terms of upgrading your car, I wouldn't say that it was overly complicated, although perfecting your tuning setups can be very complicated, and I suppose it's up to each player to put in as much time as they wish. Visual options tended to be quite simple. There was just often just a front splitter, a side skirt, and then a couple of rear wing options, but there wasn't too much more than that. Now let's take a look at some of the camera options. Not too much to look at here, but the chase cam, you can adjust the sensitivity of it. Cockpit cam as well, you can adjust slightly the placement of the camera within the car. Now the cockpit cam, I've always felt as though it's a little bit off in this game. Not bad, it's just like not perfect. But having said that, it still felt pretty immersive playing in the cockpit view, and I still enjoyed it. There's also no rear view mirror on most of the camera viewpoints, only on the bumper cam. I think it would have been good to have the option to turn it on or off on all of the viewpoints. Cycling through the MFD during a race can be quite tricky, as there's quite a lot to concentrate on now. There is only the option to map, going left and right through the menu and then up and down. You can't map, for example, brake bias up and down to a button, unless you have the FANATEC CSL DD. Another good addition to the game, I think, is that you can change the distance of the rolling starts. So you can make the cars a lot more compact at the beginning of the race, and I think this is a good addition to the game. Okay, final verdict. My goodness, that was a lot of talking. So overall, I think Gran Turismo 7 is a very highly polished game with a lot of replayability and a very, very high attention to detail. Players of all types, be it experienced long-time GT fans and even new players, will have good reason to buy and play this game. Even though I think there could be more content in terms of cars and tracks, I think there's still a very healthy amount, and what is there is incredibly detailed. If multiplayer turns out to be solid, then we have a very well-rounded game on all fronts, one which I know that I'm going to happily play for many years to come. I think at this preliminary stage, I would like to give the game a 9 out of 10, but that is only if the multiplayer turns out to be solid and a good mode. If you do have any further questions, then please do ask in the comments. But that is all from me. Thank you so much for watching this one. I hope you found it useful in some way. I shall catch you very soon with plenty more Gran Turismo 7 content. And in the meantime, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.